This is highly unusual, Steve mentioned while he and the other members of Doom stood in front of a cave entrance that was a bit more obvious than most. Besides having a rather decent path leading straight to it, there were also the giant signs that had been posted around it, all pointing to the cave entrance. This way to the secret entrance to the palace. Great treasure awaits at the end. This is the biggest trap I've ever seen, Steve muttered as he read some of the signs. They even have the illiterate covered. Sherry mentioned and pointed to the signs that just had pictures of gold, gems, and other assorted treasure on them, all pointing to the same entrance. We're not going inside, are we? There's no other entrance here. Steve waved his arms at the mountains around them. The information we were given specifically told us to come here. It even says that there are clear signs pointing to the location of the secret entrance. Steve scratched his head as he looked at the opening before them. I didn't think they would mean that so literally, Sherry mentioned as she set her hands on her hips and looked around. Isn't this a good thing? Fenrina asked. Doesn't it mean we're going the right way? Well, the thing is, it's so obviously a trap, Steve explained to her. Who has a road and signs leading up to a secret dungeon maze, let alone one attached to a palace? Why don't we use that trick you did to get us into that Kasurian palace? Fenrina asked. You didn't have enough of the faceless horrors trying to eat our faces off in jealous rage last time? Sherry asked with a glare at Steve, who groaned out and tossed his hands in the air. Okay, I still maintain that only rarely happens, and I said sorry and whatever, it worked. But also this place doesn't have an infinitarch like the other palace. This is just a duchy, Steve explained. And why are we helping them? Fenrina asked. I thought you disliked hereditary systems of governance, especially if they claim their right to rule comes from a divine source and a heavily enforced cultural class system. The other members of Doom quietly turned to look at the large werehusky for a moment. Astrid has been reading more. I can learn stuff too. She huffed defensively. While yes, that's true, Steve muttered after a moment. I'm trying to get off some various shit lists, and my disdain for monarchies, while high, is just as high for tyrants who take power in a blood coup and put lots of heads on pikes. Normally, the surrounding nations would likely take care of an evil nation quickly since evil nations are evil. But with the Almarin-Elven coalition war dragging on, they've got other things to worry about. So, I feel slightly more responsible than normal. And the massive pile of treasure we were promised when we took the job isn't a factor? Fenrina asked. It's only partially a factor. Steve tried to wave it off. I'm also confused about this being a duchy, because it's bigger than that teeny-tiny kingdom that you're a fairy godfather to, and richer and more important. But it's just a duchy, Fenrina asked next. Yeah, reasons. Steve shrugged. I don't know how the whole monarchy royal system works, but the Duchy of Delight is indeed a duchy and not a kingdom, for reasons. Is that really the name? Duchy of Delight? Fenrina arched a brow as she asked that. I think it's a bastardization of an older name that sounded like Delight and just got written down that way at some point, Steve replied with another shrug, before waving his hands in the air. But none of that is important right now. What is important is that we have to get through here, and it's super obviously a trap, so we all need to be ready. Larry Love is more of a lover than a rogue, but even he knows it's unwise to disarm a trap by sticking your hand into it, Larry pointed out then. There's no other way through. Besides, we're adventurers. How many traps have we survived so far? Steve exclaimed. All of them. So far. Fenrina answered with a wag of her tail as she hefted her shield and stepped up front, ready to dive into danger head first, as always. Steve just looked over at Sherry and Larry, who each sighed after a moment, and then settled into position behind the werehusky. Now properly positioned, the four walked forward into what they were rather positive was a trap. The cave entrance quickly gave way to an actual dungeon instead of a natural cave formation. While it wasn't unusual for palaces to have secret entrances and dungeon complexes beneath them, it was certainly unusual for the entry to one such dungeon to have a door that said, "Dungeon starts here," clear as could be for them to go through. Steve carefully inspected the door, checking for any signs that it was connected to traps or other mechanisms that might spring something upon them. but after a little he couldn't find anything wrong with the door and simply opened it. As they stepped through into the room beyond, they found themselves in a basic square room with nothing in it but another door. "Okay," Steve muttered, and the four slowly walked into the room, spreading out as they looked around for traps and the like, but once more discovered nothing. As Steve approached the next door, he could see it had a puzzle lock set into it, rather than a normal handle. It only took him a few moments of examination to reach out and spin the wheels of the puzzle into their correct place, and the door opened up into the ceiling to reveal another square room beyond. Steve hesitantly stepped into the next room and saw that one of the floor tiles was glowing green, and on the other side of the room was a green box, the side of the glowing tile. "Are you serious?" "About what?" Fenrina asked as she followed him into the next room. That was more of a general outburst than a specific question. Steve muttered and scratched his head before picking up the box, walking over and setting it on the glowing tile. Once he had done that, the next door rumbled up into the ceiling to reveal another square room beyond. "I am so confused by this place." "Why?" Fenrina asked as they walked into the next room, which had two different colored glowing tiles and boxes this time. "Because this doesn't make sense. Dungeons are usually built out of actual dungeons, or they were mining tunnels, or all number of things before becoming dungeons. Adventuring dungeons, I mean, not dungeons. This place looks like it's been specifically built like this. Just a series of rooms. Who the hell would build a place like this? And why?" he asked as he moved one box over and waved for Fenrina to grab the other. Once both boxes were in place, the next door opened. When they walked into the next room, Steve saw a puzzle lock on the door ahead of them, as well as the walls to either side. Once they were in the middle of the room, there was a heavy click, and the walls slowly started to rumble closer. "Okay, some actual danger," he said, sounding more relieved than anything. "What do we do?" Fenrina asked as she looked around. "Just turn the rings into place, it's super simple," Steve said, and walked over to one wall to turn the wheels like he had before. It clicked into place, and the wall stopped closing in on them as Sherry walked over and did the same to the other side. "I don't get it. It's like they're giving us a chance to see how each part works, and then slowly making it harder." "That's a stupid design choice," Sherry said, as they unlocked the door to the next room. In here, they saw a blue gem sitting in the middle of the floor, and beyond that was a blue-colored door with a slot in the center that would clearly fit a blue gem. "What's the point of all this? Shouldn't they have a few super difficult traps set up to just kill anyone who walks in?" Sherry asked. "I know, right?" Steve replied with a snort as he picked up the blue gem to press it into the spot for it in the next door. The next room was slightly different, however. Across from them was a red door with a slot for a gem, but there wasn't a gem in sight. Then to the right was a yellow door, and in front of it a glowing tile for a yellow box, but no box itself. So off to the left was a door with a puzzle lock. Is this all that there is here? Progressively more tedious locks to pass? Is that the plan? To bore us into leaving? Maybe they'll start adding more traps and monsters the deeper we go? And better loot? Fenrina suggested, but the other three just laughed at the idea. Who would possibly think it would be a good idea to make a dungeon like that? "What's the point of it?" Steve asked, as he quickly spun the rings of the puzzle lock into place to get the door to open. When it did open up, he saw the yellow box at the end of a small alcove. However, in between him and the box was a short slime glob. Steve looked down at it for a moment before it lunged forward and glomped onto his leg. "Ah!" He hoped back on one leg, waving the other around as he tried to kick the slime off to no avail. "Hold still! I got this!" Fenrina insisted, as she rushed towards him with her sword out. "Wait! It's a slime! You'll stab my leg!" Steve cried out and waved his hands to ward Fenrina off as he kept hopping around while the slime tried to eat his shin guard. "Well then, how do we kill it?" Fenrina asked as she paused. "Just stab it. Carefully," Steve hissed out as he kept wiggling his leg around before Fenrina carefully stabbed the slime without stabbing Steve in the process. The slime slid off his leg then and settled into a puddle on the floor where it bubbled for a moment before making a burping sound and settling down. "That's it?" Fenrina asked in confusion. "Slimes are very odd creatures. It'll reconstitute itself in a few hours unless you break down the slime guts, the slime's slime with the appropriate magical reagents," Steve explained as he walked into the alcove to get the yellow box. "Well, aren't you going to do that?" Fenrina asked. "Hell no, salt is expensive." Steve snorted as he carried the box over to the other side of the room. "But it'll return and possibly attack someone," Fenrina pointed out. "Well, no one but adventurers should be coming in here, so let them deal with it. I'm not wasting good salt on a little slime when we won't be here in a few hours anyway." He was about to put the box on the tile when he paused. "Larry, get up there in case there's another slime." "Why Larry Love?" the dwarf protested even as he approached. "'Cause you've got a hammer, and those are great for squishing slimes," Steve said with a shrug. Once the dwarf was in position, he set the box into place, and sure enough there was another slime waiting inside. But this time Larry was able to quickly squish it with his hammer, though as he did the others couldn't help but snicker a little at the sound it made. "Geez, Larry, did you have to let one rip?" "That was not Larry Love, that was the slime," the dwarf growled out. "Yeah, sure, just like that time you tried to blame Fenrina." Sherry snorted and Larry glared at the werehusky, who just smiled back with a big smile on her face as she wagged her tail. So far no one had discovered her secret, that it was indeed her that one time. Regardless, Steve retrieved the gem from the alcove and set it into the next door. When it slid up to reveal a room beyond this one was a little different. There was a table with a few coins and a loaf of bread on it, and past that was another door with a regular doorknob. "The fuck?" Steve muttered as he walked in and picked up the loaf of bread. He sniffed at it and squeezed it gently for a moment. "It's like maybe a day old? It's not stale. Who put it there? Although, now that you mention it, the torches are lit, aren't they?" As Sherry mentioned that, the others looked around, realizing they'd taken the lit torches on the wall for granted. "Well, I'm not taking the bread. Could be poison." Steve shrugged and set it back on the table. When he went to open the next door, they saw two slimes slowly bubbling across the floor, and this time there were two puzzle doors and one multicolored door with two glowing tiles in front of it, as well as a gem door. "See? They're just progressively making it harder and leaving loot every so often," Fenrina said. "This doesn't make any sense. Who designs a place like this?" Steve exclaimed as he waved his arms around. Then as he approached the slimes with sword in hand this time to stab them before they tried to eat his feet, he hissed out, "There better not be much more of this." 6 hours later, the members of Doom were standing in front of a very large, ornate door that they had already fit 11 gems into and were getting ready to fit the last into place. Besides slimes, they'd fought zombies, golems, skeletons, bigger slimes, ghosts, ghasts which were different than ghosts, several magic apparitions, 3 gelatinous cubes, 1 gelatinous polyhedron, and 1 very ornery gloop, which shouldn't be confused with a slime. Besides the puzzle doors, boxes, and gems, they'd also had to deal with dozens if not hundreds of traps, jumping across platforms, climbing walls with oddly obvious handholds, riddle-obsessed gates, and even some magical traps. For all their efforts, they had some gold and jewelry that wasn't worth nearly the headache they'd gone through. Of course, there had also been various bits of armor and weapons along the way, but almost none of the armor fit, and they had no need for more weapons than they could use, so they'd left it behind since it all weighed quite a lot, to say nothing of all the space it would have taken up. As they prepared for the next door, the group was in a bit of disarray. Larry was still being followed by a small rain cloud that kept raining on him. Sherry was still the color purple. Despite the protests of the others, Fenrina was eating a large turkey leg they'd found in a trash can after having already eaten what they'd dubbed dungeon duck. Plus, Steve was slowly rubbing his eyebrows to get them to grow back in with his magic after having lost them in yet another fireball to the face. "I hate this place," he said calmly as they took a breather. "The food's good," Fenrina muttered as she took another big bite off the turkey leg. It can't be healthy to eat food we find in trash cans, barrels, and other such places, Steve muttered, but had stopped trying to get her to quit eating everything they found. You're just, jelly, 'cause all you have, to eat is really dry salty. Granola mix. Fenrina shrugged as she spoke while eating and tearing little pieces of turkey meat off the leg. Maybe it would be better if someone hadn't gone through and picked the fruit out of everyone's granola mix. Steve growled back, but Fenrina just kept eating without addressing his comment. Steve just sighed after that and stood up once his eyebrows had grown back in. Okay, are we ready? He asked as he looked to the others. Larry Love would love the rain to stop. The dwarf grumbled as a tiny lightning bolt struck his helmet. I'm ready to not be purple anymore. Sherry agreed with a nod. Fenrina held up a finger as she growled and ripped off one last big chunk of meat off the leg before tossing it aside. Then she took her time chewing it before swallowing and finally smiling at them as she wagged her tail. Ready? Okay, let's do this, Steve said with far less enthusiasm than usual. He set the final gem into the door and stepped back as it slid up into the ceiling. This room was yet another gray stone square like so very many of the others, except when they'd suddenly been in clouds, or that underwater bit. Everyone had hated the underwater bit. There were two large ornate treasure chests on the far wall, but in between them was a massive throne, with an equally massive rune-inlaid sword leaning against it. All around the room were bones that looked too large to be human, yet would fit together just like a normal human skeleton. Seriously? This is the final boss? Steve snorted as he saw it and looked around. All right, someone find the half-giant skull. There it is. Fenrina pointed to a large skull that, while human-shaped, was significantly larger. It was set into a large horned helm that was almost always reserved for bad guys, especially one so large they weren't worried about the horrible tactical mistake it was to wear horns on your helm. Steve approached it and reached into one of his pouches of surprising depth as he pulled out a 3-foot by 3-foot square of lead 3 inches thick, which he handed to Fenrina to carry. Then he picked the skull up and set it in the corner of the room before leaning the lead square against it. Okay, someone go kick the sword or touch the chest or something, Steve said, as he made sure the skull was pressed firmly against the corner of the room by the lead. Fenrina walked over and tried to open up one of the chests, but it was locked shut. Even as she fiddled with it, though, the bones in the room began to swirl around and rise up, forming into the skeleton of a half-giant sitting on the throne. But the skull behind the lead didn't move. Once the rest of the body was formed, Steve waited a second and then pulled the lead plate out of the way. There was a lightning bolt from the ceiling that struck the skull just after he did. Bwahahaha! Prepare to suffer for... What the hell is going on here? The skull had gotten 2 blue glowing eyes and was looking around from its place in the corner. Lead stops magic, Steve said in way of explanation, as he began to jam the lead square back into his pouch of surprising depth. In the background, the rain cloud above Larry fizzled to nothing and Sherry regained her normal color. You bastard! You cheated! The skull exclaimed. Yeah, whatever. You going to open those chests or what? Steve asked. It wouldn't even matter if I could. You see... Hey, stop gnawing on my leg! Steve turned around to see Fenrina gnawing on one of the half-giant skeleton's femurs. Hey, put that down! You don't know where it's been. Get that out of your mouth. You just had turkey. It's likely covered in necromantic magic, Steve cried out. But I threw da urke egg on the grund, she replied while partially still chewing on the femur. You found that leg on the ground as well. Put it down, Steve insisted. Fine! Fenrina sighed as she spat the large leg bone out. I'll go get the turkey leg! She walked off to find the leg she'd thrown aside earlier. That's not... Steve started, and then closed his eyes and rubbed the bridge of his nose as he sighed. Forget it. What were you saying? He asked the skull. These chests are empty, Sherry called out as she had gotten one open while Steve dealt with the skull and Fenrina. What do you mean empty? Steve called back. Empty, devoid of treasure or reward. No one was expecting someone to finish this so early. the skull explained. Finish what? Steve cried out as he waved his arms around. This is supposed to be the secret entrance to the palace. There's supposed to be a massive treasure room filled with the treasures of the fucking duchy. Where the hell is it all? You're the final boss. Ha! I'm not even the final boss. You foolish adventurers. You get nothing. The skull rattled at him. Where's the way out? Where's everything else? Tell me. Steve growled and gave the skull a kick as it bounced off the wall and rolled around. I'll tell you nothing, the skull exclaimed. Want me to get my werehusky back in here? I'll let her gnaw on your face. Get her tongue up into your eye sockets. See how you like that. Steve threatened, and the skull rattled for a moment in the helm. No, don't. Fine. I'll tell you, but you won't like what I have to say anyway. You see, this place isn't done. They're still working on it. Like I said, no one expected anyone to get this far so far. If you crouch in that corner, you can slowly back through part of the wall which isn't really there. The skull pointed with his eyes as Larry moved to the corner and crouched down before scooting backwards and seemed to move through the solid wall like it wasn't there. Steve, you need to see this. Steve sighed and picked up the skull as he walked over to the corner and then crouched down and did the same thing as Larry. When he slipped through the fake wall, he found himself in a much more natural-looking cave area, with stalagmites and stalactites all around. There were also some stones, masonry equipment, and a board painted black and yellow to keep people from going further. What's this say? Steve muttered as he saw Larry pointing to a piece of paper stuck to the board. We hoped you enjoyed the delightful dungeon alpha build. If you got this far, we're sorry, but the rest of the dungeon isn't finished. Please return for the beta release. What? He turned and looked back and could see the dungeon stretched out before them, the individual rooms outlined in black. How am I seeing this? My helm is blessed with sight of no clipping, the skull informed him. This is such bullshit, Steve cried out and looked around once more. Past the yellow and black board, he could see a set of stairs leading up to what looked like daylight. We're getting that treasure. He growled and began to walk past the board. Hey, you can't go that way. Didn't you read the sign? The skull shouted as Steve just growled and tossed it into a nearby wheelbarrow. It's a sign, not a guard. Fenrina, Sherry, we're going, he called out as the other members of Doom quickly moved to catch up with him as he headed up the staircase leading from the cave into the light. When they emerged, they were in a large courtyard surrounded by high stone walls and towers, right besides an impressive-looking palace built into the mountain. Well, at least they weren't lying about the palace access. What are we going to do? Fenrina asked as she caught up, once more chewing on the turkey leg. Deal with this like we should have originally, Steve growled out and walked towards the palace besides them. To his surprise, there weren't any guards around, and the first door he opened was entirely unlocked. They walked through some empty hallways until they found a large door with what sounded like a party coming from the other side. Okay, stand back. He waved the others back and pulled some ingredients from his pouches. After a few moments, a massive stone fist rose up out of the ground, and Steve pulled his arm back before thrusting it forward, and the stone fist copied the motion by slamming into the wooden doors hard enough to smash them off their hinges and send them toppling forward into the room beyond. All around there were gasps and shouts of surprise as Steve walked in on top of the now toppled doors. Oh, I'm sorry. Am I interrupting? He asked in the sort of way that implied he was being snarky. Yet, to his surprise, he got a reply.